All right, students, this is recording number 2 of the Animal Nutrition and Digestive System lecture. So I'm going to skip ahead to where we left off on the previous lecture. And this slide pops up just before the recording ends. All right, so this is the food pyramid. Y'all don't have to memorize this. I'm not going to test you memorization on this, but I do want to go over some details on it. So I guess the questions, there will be a question or two based on what I talk about right now. The width down here means that an awful lot of your diet is recommended to consist of this material right here, a large chunk, but somewhat smaller of this, and so on and so forth, working up. That's the idea of the pyramid. So the reason it's so heavy with bread, cereal, rice, pasta, and things like this is these are all things that are rich in carbohydrates, preferably complex carbohydrates, so not particularly refined. You know, a lot of grains, really, that are in more or less somewhat natural state, not over-processed. So, you know, whole wheat, multigrain bread, things like that. Those carbohydrates are your primary fuel source, and the bulk of the nutrition you need is the stuff that powers your metabolism, you know, cellular respiration, to generate ATP, and that's preferentially carbohydrates, glucose ultimately, but you want that to come in a complex form, which is these grain-rich materials right here. Now, all of these have protein and lipids and things like that in them as well, but smaller amounts, high in carbohydrates. The next group right here, vegetables and fruits, again, is going to give you an awful lot of carbohydrate energy in the form of sugars of various sorts. Simple sugars, disaccharides and monosaccharides that you taste in fruits, typically more along the lines of starch and things like that, particularly, you know, in some of your vegetables right here. Additionally, these are also going to provide you lipids and proteins, not high concentrations of them, but all of this stuff has protein. All of this stuff has protein in it. All of these have lipids. All of these have lipids. And a lot of dietary fiber, which you do need, quite a bit of roughage, which is to say cellulose, the material that makes up plant cell walls, is non-digestible by humans, but required in our digestive system, in our diet, for a good intestinal health, particularly the large intestines. This entry up here, meat, poultry, fish, dry beans, eggs, fruits, nuts. These are your concentrated protein sources. So you don't need as much of this. So you don't need an all-protein diet that has its own health, negative health consequences if you eat a protein only diet or an exceptionally protein-rich diet at the expense of these other things right here. You'll have some problems. But these give you your proteins, which give you the amino acids that are required for your diet. So you don't need a lot of this, but you must have some. And then finally, fats and oils, you do need a small amount of in your diet. You must have some lipids in your diet. There are certain things that you must have. But this picture I don't really like because it's heavily processed stuff, which is not what we're really after right here, like mayonnaise right at the top right here, because that does have lipids in it. But again, you do need some oils, just not a lot. All right, a little bit about the food pyramid. Going on, let's talk about the role of the different components of your diet. So carbohydrates, again, these are primarily fuel source for metabolism. Every cell has got some carbohydrates in it. Of course, the monosaccharides that we process readily and absorb readily are glucose and fructose. Disaccharides that come predominantly in our diet are lactose and sucrose. These are disaccharides. This is fruit and plant sugar. Lactose, of course, is milk sugar. And then there's also maltose, which comes from a lot of grains. Those are all disaccharides. Your preferred source of carbohydrates from a dietary standpoint is starch. Starch, preferably that's buried in complex structural material like whole grains. But anyway, that's the role of carbohydrates in your diet as a metabolic fuel and raw material to make the other macromolecules out of. So you can take a carbohydrate and use that as the skeleton for making an amino acid or the skeleton for making a fatty acid and lipids and things like that. Those are all interchangeable with some amount of work to some degree. All right, I mentioned it before. You do have to have fiber in your diet, which comes from intact plant matter, fruits and vegetables, grains, and all of that stuff. It's not a nutrient because we don't absorb it and make things out of it, but we do need the fiber for our intestines to function correctly. And as it says down here, combines with bile acids and cholesterol. So, that's the fiber, for instance, in oats and oatmeal, famous for pulling down cholesterol levels. Since we get too much in our diet, too much meat, too much red meat particularly, that plant fiber plays an important role in absorbing excess. All right. Proteins. Why do you need proteins? Well, you are made of 20 different amino acids, so you must get those amino acids from your diet. Now, you can make amino acids from carbohydrates and lipids to a degree, but you do need other amino acids to get the amine groups from, at the very least, to make the amino acids that you're capable of synthesizing. On top of that, for humans and a lot of primates, and a lot of mammals, there's certain ones that only can come from your diet. And so there are 8 that we must get in our diet, 9 for children, but 8 amino acids that must come from our food. That means of the 20 different amino acids, there are 12, or actually 11 for adults, 11 for adults, where we can make those amino acids from these 8 amino acids. So we can make the others, but these we can't make. We must get them in our diet. Meat automatically has all 20 amino acids, and dairy products, things derived from animals, so eggs, dairy products, and meats all contain all the amino acids. They are complete in that sense. On the other hand, vegetables, as we see right here, don't typically contain all 8 of those required amino acids. Corn, as you can see right here, has 6. Beans over here have 7, but not all 8. And so if you want to remain healthy and get a complete diet that's vegetarian, that's perfectly doable, perfectly okay. But you must combine certain vegetable groups together. Classically, beans and corn, rice and beans, rice, wheat, corn are all grasses, so they're all grains, so they're typically over on this side right here. Beans, squash are 2 great big sources. Cabbages and things like that will all be over on this side right here and provide you the other amino acids. Beans, of course, have the highest concentration of amino acids. The seeds are rich with concentrated proteins and some lipids. So that's what you must get in your diet. And as it says right here, children also need arginine on top of tryptophan. All right, why do you need lipids? Well, there are certain lipids that are required in your diet to make the fatty acids that are part of phospholipids and cell membranes, and the fatty acids that are components of cell membrane material. That's the key thing right there. And also you need lipids in order to produce cholesterol. You can synthesize some of it, but you need the raw material from your diet to make cholesterol and the various hormones that are derived from cholesterol. What we don't need is too much of this. And as far as your sources of dietary lipids, you really prefer to get those unsaturated. This is a double bond here because it doesn't have all of its hydrogens in it, hence unsaturated. You want unsaturated fatty acids coming from plant sources. Olive oil, walnuts, canola oil, things like that are all rich in unsaturated fatty acids. You don't want so much of these fatty acids right here. And you don't want vegetable fatty acids, oils from vegetables that have been converted into a solid form like margarine and lard and things like that, because unless they've gone to great lengths to avoid it, those guys will have a unsaturated fatty acid that still has a double bond right here, but it's switched to a trans bond. So the fatty acid has a little kink in it, but appears more straight. Hence it solidifies at room temperature and looks more like this physically and looks like this superficially, but it's still got a double bond in this location. But instead of being a cis double bond, it's a trans double bond, which just gives a little kink to it right here. It still solidifies. Those trans double bonds are extremely unhealthy. We don't want them in our diet. Diet on obesity. The key thing here is that any of these nutrients are all required in small amounts, moderate amounts, large amounts, large amounts right here. But excess in all of these is possible with health negative effects. Too many carbohydrates is the primary source of overweight, obesity in the human population. Not enough fiber, because we eat an overly processed diet, leads to serious problems with cholesterol control and intestinal health. All right. Proteins, we typically get too much protein in our diet, and too many amino acids in our diet tend to lead to some accumulation illnesses. It's not quite as bad as the obesity problem, but all of this stuff in excess can be converted into sugars and then into lipids for storage, contributing to that obesity issue. And then the lipids themselves, we need relatively small amounts, preferably those plant-based lipids again. All right. Vitamins. All right. So we would have talked about this briefly in 1406, but coming back to it again, what is a vitamin? It's an organic compound made by a living thing, by a plant typically. All right. Some vitamins we can also get from animal food sources, but traditionally from plants. So these are organic molecules that another living thing makes that we can't make, and therefore must take in through our diet. Vitamin C, vitamin B, vitamin D, vitamin E, all of those. Some of them are water-based. Some of them are fat-soluble. Vitamin E is fat-soluble. Vitamin C is water-soluble. All right, so you take vitamin E as a tablet, that is lipidy, it's oily, fish oil. Vitamin C you take as a hard tablet like an aspirin that dissolves in water. It's derived from plants in that particular case. Both are needed. You can't overdose on vitamin C because it's water soluble, so the excess is removed with your urine. I mean, it's technically possible to get way too much in you at one point and probably cause you harm, but generally we dump the excess. The fat-soluble ones, we do not dump the excess, so you can overdose on these things. You can kill yourself with vitamin E. Too much is a bad thing, so you have to be careful with these. Some is needed. Too much can be very bad. Defects of these things lead to all kinds of problems. Lack of vitamin E leads to all kinds of metabolic problems, difficulties maintaining integrity of the skin, any number of things. Lack of vitamin C, scurvy, the woe of sailors who spent lots of time at sea away from sources of vegetable matter. The lack of vitamin C caused major failures of connective tissue over time, and death, if extending long enough. All right. Classically, a lot of vitamins function as antioxidants. They are things that remove reactive chemicals from our metabolism. So an antioxidant binds to O1 or O3 or even O2 in small amounts and removes that from a chemical environment. An oxidizer is oxygen, classically, in tissues. There are other things that function as oxidizers as well, but classically it's actually the atom oxygen itself in forms that are not useful to you. All right. You do need to know a little bit about vitamins. I'm not going to ask you specific questions on the functions of these vitamins right here. I do want you to be able to distinguish between water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins from the purposes of overdosing issues. Which ones have the dangers? And of course, that's fat-soluble vitamins here. All of these can be overdosed on. These typically cannot. Minerals. Minerals are minerals, so these are elements coming out of the periodic table. Please know these 8. Their roles, their names, what you do with them. So a mineral is not a vitamin. You can get this, directly from soil. Classically, we get these minerals in our food, both in meat and plant matter. Just depends. All of these things are available. There are certain foods that we can eat to target, these particular minerals. All right, stages of enzymatic digestion. I want to review this again, but very, very important. There will be quite a bit of information on our test about this subject right here. So please go over this table and make sure that you can identify it. Salivary amylase, pancreatic amylase, enzymes that break apart disaccharides. These are disaccharadases like lipase and maltase and sucrase. All right. Starts in the oral cavity, carries on in the small intestines, finishes in the small intestines. Protein digestion starts in the stomach. Pepsin, in conjunction with the low pH, the acid bath of hydrochloric acid, denatures proteins, allowing pepsin to get a hold of particular bonds in a polypeptide and breaking them down. Pancreatic trypsin and chymotrypsin break those fragments of polypeptides into shorter polypeptide chains. And then the carboxidases, the dipeptidases, the aminopeptidases all target very short polypeptides, 2, 3, 4 amino acids long, and break them down into single amino acids, which are absorbed, just like these single sugars, the monosaccharides, which are absorbed. Similar sort of process for DNA and RNA. We do digest that stuff. Pancreatic nucleases released by the small intestines themselves. Sometimes you'll see these enzymes referred to as brush border enzymes because they're released by the cells, the brushy sort of microvilli equipped cells lining the small intestines, brush border enzymes. These are not released by the pancreas, they're released by cells, epithelial cells lining the digestive tract. These guys are released by the pancreas. And then finally, pancreatic lipase, which in conjunction with bile emulsifies fats so they become soluble in water, and then pancreatic lipase breaks triglycerides and phospholipids into glycerol and fatty acids. Last, we'll talk about regulation of the digestive process. You need to know about these 5 hormones right here, as you see: secretin, gastric inhibitory polypeptide, motilin, cholecystokinin, and gastrin. The pluses mean these are stimulatory hormones. The negative right here means this is an inhibitory hormone, as this suggests right here. The arrows are from the source to the organ they act on. So cholecystokinin is released by the small intestines, the duodenum specifically, in response to very low pH liquids coming out of the stomach, and it stimulates the gallbladder to release bile to emulsify the fats that are coming with that low pH liquid coming out of the stomach. The idea here is if you eat a whole bunch of lipids, the hydrochloric acid in your stomach has no effect on that oil because it can't get at it. It doesn't dissolve in water. So the liquid in your stomach, the acid is not consumed. There's no reaction that consumes the acid, unlike enzymes, and acid is consumed in a reaction. And so the liquid coming out of the stomach is still extremely acidic. So that's a trigger to release a bunch of bile to emulsify those lipids right there. All right. At the same time, low pH or high osmolarity, which means just a lot of stuff dissolved in the liquid right here, is a stimulus for the duodenum to release secretin, which stimulates particularly the pancreas to release all of its digestive hormones. So that's lipases, the hormones or the enzymes breaking down carbohydrates and proteins and nucleic acids and lipids are all released as a group by the pancreas. Gastric inhibitory polypeptide. Basically, when the duodenum is overloaded with stuff, especially if it's really, really acidic, that is a stimulus going back to the stomach saying, slow down, hang on to that stuff and release it in smaller dots, less material, please. Also, if your stomach is empty and you're basically just pushing stomach acid into the small intestines, that's another inhibitory signal from the small intestines back to the stomach saying, cease, stop, stop. Not so much of this. When you fill the stomach itself, that stimulates the release of gastrin, which affects the stomach, which increases the production of pepsin, hydrochloric acid, and increases motility, the muscular contractions of the stomach. So gastrin is released by the stomach and acts on the stomach due to the mechanical distension and the stimulus of food going into the stomach. Motilin, same thing. As material is coming into the small intestines, especially if the osmolarity is really, really high, meaning it's a really concentrated, thick stuff or not particularly well digested, motilin stimulates the stomach to churn and mechanically grind more to process that stuff more aggressively before releasing it into the small intestine. So that's your hormonal regulation. And that looks like it's it. I'll call that a wrap. That's the end of the chapter on nutrition.